Chapter 12. Chief Meyers. Cholula Valley is high up among the peaks and spurs of the San Jacinto Mountains, a wild, barren, and inaccessible spot. The Cholula village situated there was one of the most interesting that we visited. Cholulas seemed a more clear-headed, more individual, and more independent people than any other tribe we saw. This is partly due to their native qualities. The tribe having originally been one of the most warlike and powerful in the country. The isolation of this village also tended to keep these Indians self-respecting and independent. There is no white settlement within 10 miles, there being comparatively little to tempt white men into these mountain fastnesses. The houses are of adobe, thatched with reeds, 3 of the houses having shingled roofs, and 1 has the luxury of a floor. The Cholulas are practically proud and spirited people. They will endure a great deal before they ask for help. Last winter, they were for many weeks without sufficient food due to crop failures. The teacher of their school repeatedly begged them to let her write to the Indian agent for help, but they refused. At last, one night, 2 of the head men came to her, and she said she might write. They could no longer subdue the hunger. She wrote the letter. The next morning at daylight, the Indians were at her door again. They would not permit her to send the letter. They had reconsidered, they said, and would not beg. They would rather starve. Helen Hunt Jackson on the Condition and Needs of the Mission Indians of California, 1883. The biggest regret of my life is that I never finished my college education. I was born in 1880 in a small Cholula village, and I went to school there. We're one of the tribes that make up of what are usually called the Mission Indians of Southern California. Far back in the past, however, Cholulas are descended from a Shoshone on the background. Then my family moved here to Riverside when I was about 11 or 12, and I went to the public schools here. I didn't even think of going to college right away after high school. Instead, I caught a various semi-pro teams around here in Southern California and Arizona. And New Mexico, too. Not an organized ball, just bush league ball, semi-pro, although I made it a living of sorts at it. However, after a few years of that, I applied for admission to Dartmouth and was accepted. I was a few years older than the average college student, and getting accepted to Dartmouth was a great thrill for me. You know that Dartmouth originally started back in King George's time as Moore's Indian Charity School? It was a missionary school staffed by missionaries sent over from England to convert and educate the Indians. That was when America was still an English colony. Eleazar Wheelock was the founder of the school's Moore Indian Charity School, and he convinced King George III of the good work that was being done. So the Crown made large sums of money available for its continuance. However, the Earl of Dartmouth was even more impressed, and he set up a sizable fund with the stipulation that it was to be used for the purpose of teaching any Indian who was qualified to matriculate at the school. That fund still exists today. Although few Indians know anything about it, I didn't know about it until I came into contact with Ralph Glaze. While I was playing in a tournament in Albuquerque, New Mexico, late in 1904, Ralph was on Walter Camp's All-American football team when he was at Dartmouth. He later became a pitcher with the Boston Red Sox. Ralph told me about Dartmouth, and through his efforts and the information he obtained for me, I eventually got admitted myself. I was the first Cholula to ever get such a wonderful chance. So in September of 1905, I left home and went east to Hanover, New Hampshire, to avail myself for the opportunity. However, I never got to finish. I regret it to this day. In 1906, After my freshman year, I went to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania to play summer ball. I was ineligible for baseball at Dartmouth anyway because I'd already played professionally and I had a chance to make a little money over the summer playing for the Harrisburg club in the Tri-State League. That was my first club in organized baseball. When the season was over and it was time to go to college, my mom got very ill out in California. My brother wrote to me that he wanted me home, so I came back. My mother eventually recovered, but by the time she did, it was too late to go back to Dartmouth. That was an unfortunate thing. Then, well, there was nothing else to do but go on with baseball, at least temporarily. From Harrisburg, I went to Butte, Montana in the Northwestern League, from Butte to St. Paul in the American Association, and from St. Paul, Minnesota, I was sold to the New York Giants. That was in 1908. No regrets about it. I liked playing ball, and I made a good at it, but I do wish I had finished my college education. You know, Dartmouth is just like the Giants. Once a Giant, always a Giant. Mr. McGraw instilled the spirit there and never left you. And this is quoted from Chaucer. Once a Dartmouth, always a Dartmouth. You never lose that affection for the old school, regardless if you just get in there and get a cup of coffee. They instill that spirit into you. That last Dartmouth men are very, very close all over the world. They'll never turn you down. In those days, of course, baseball was different than it is today. I don't mean it in as a game, although that was a different too. I mean it was not well thought of like it is today. Ball players are considered a rowdy bunch. We were admitted to hotels, that is first-class hotels, like the sailors in Boston on the Commons. No sailors allowed. We were in that class. We were just second-class citizens, even worse. Mr. McGraw was the one who changed all that. He was the one who paid the price and even more than the price to get his ball team into the best hotels. Now the ball player is respected, but it wasn't like that when I started. You have to realize that I began playing ball in the Bush Leagues, that is, when Dewey in Manila. That was in the late 1890s, quite a while back. Of course, they didn't have scouts in those days for bonuses, nothing like that. It was a situation where you needed more than they needed you. Or they needed more than you needed you. Today, it seems to be just the opposite, but in those days, you just pushed yourself in. If you liked to play ball and they saw you, they took you, that's all. And then it was up to you to prove yourself. Ball players in those days didn't take too kindly to rookies either. Not tough babies. They figured a youngster was in there after one of their jobs. That's the only way they looked at a youngster, and I don't like to say this, but in those days when I was young, I was considered a foreigner. I didn't belong. I was an Indian. I remember I broke in with the Harrisburg Club in 1906. There were a lot of old-timers on that team. That was my first club in organized ball, and I joined them in the middle of the season after school was over at Dartmouth. Soon after I got there, the catcher got hurt in the late innings of a game, broke his finger, couldn't catch, so the manager, Billy Hamilton, remember him, not the Billy Hamilton today, he told me to put the stuff on, which I did. The pitcher was a spitball pitcher, and I checked the signs out with him, but the first ball he pitched, he hit me right in the belly with it. I called for a fastball, and he threw me a spitter. Crossed me up all the way, so there I was, a young fellow behind the plate, being crossed up in my very first game. After that, I didn't give him any signs at all, because I was on my own then. I wasn't expecting anything, and I couldn't catch him. "What's the matter? You're not giving any signs," he yelled in at me. "What's the use?" I said. "You go ahead and pitch." And I caught him. When it was time for me to hit, I had no bat. I had just reported there for some reason I didn't have my bat. So, when it came my turn to hit, I went in to pick up a bat, and some guy growls at me, "Hey, Busher, drop that bat." Just like that. So I looked at the manager, and I told him I didn't have any bat. Well, we went over and grabbed a bat and handed it to me. Of course, I had no choice of bat or anything. And when I got up to the plate, the first pitch came whistling and sort of high and inside, right at the old head, Kind of tamed me down, but I figured it would be like that. It was tough, and don't think it wasn't. In those days, you had to have guts. That's all there was to it. However, on the next pitch, I hit one over the fence, clear into the Susquehanna River. There were 2 men on base at the time, and that won the ball game. And then the next day, the papers came out and gave me credit for it. And after things started to get better. Two years later, in 1908, I was on the New York Giants, and I did pretty well at St. Paul, the American Association, that year. And late in the season, St. Paul sold me to the Giants. I didn't get in any games with the Giants during the little that remained of the 1908 season. Heck, they had Roger Bresnahan there, was the best catcher in the league. But the next year, Roger was traded to St. Louis, where he had the opportunity to manage the team. George Shelley and I divided the catching. By 1910, however, I was the regular catcher for the Giants, and as you know, I stayed as the regular catcher until 1916, batted over 300 for the 7-year period on the Giants, including 358 in 1912. Then, in 1916, I was traded to the Brooklyn Dodgers, but once a Giant, always a Giant. That's the truth. It was because of Mr. McGraw. What a great man he was. Oh, we held him in high esteem. We respected him every way. According to McGraw, his ball team never lost a game. He lost it, not his players. He fought for his ball players and protected them. You couldn't come around and second-guess McGraw's players in his presence without having a fight on your hands right there. He stood up for us all at times. Of course, errors of judgment, not thinking, and not being alert were taboo with him. We wouldn't stand for that, but regular errors, he often said errors are part of the game, and if there weren't any, the game would be perfect, and no one would ever come out and see us. But don't make too many of them, he said, or else you won't stay here for very long. And how he hated lies. Don't ever come in with the alibi. That didn't go with him. No, he loved the truth, and you'd better come with the truth and nothing else. I remember one time a younger player was on second base and the next batter singled. This kid came tearing around the third base and scored, but on the way around he missed the base. The third baseman shouted for the ball and touched the base. The umpire called the youngster out. "What's the matter with you? Didn't you touch the base?" McGraw asked him. "Yes, I did," the kid said. "I stepped right on it." "You know something," McGraw said. "That'll cost you $100 from stepping on that base. Anytime the umpire says you didn't touch the base, you didn't touch it. They never call that play any other way." That was McGraw. What a wonderful man he was. Honest and forthright and charitable in the deepest sense of the word. We always called him Mr. McGraw. Never John or Mac. Always Mr. McGraw. And how he hated being called Muggsy. That was a sore spot with him sometimes. We'd call him that behind his back, but if he ever heard you, he wasn't your friend anymore. It was the same way with Bill Clem, the great old umpire. If Bill Clem was umpiring behind the plate, all you had to do was call him Catfish, and out of the game you'd go. That's all. Just the one word, and you were out. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe it was because hang on a minute. Maybe it was because he had rather prominent lips, and when he'd call a ball or a strike, he'd let fly a rather fine spray from his mouth. Sort of gave the general impression of a catfish, you know. He was a little sensitive about it, to say the least. Those were great Giants teams the years I was there. Take, for instance, Mathewson. I caught almost every game he pitched for 7 years. What a pitcher he was. The greatest that ever lived. He had almost perfect control. Really almost perfect. In 1913, he pitched 68 consecutive innings without walking a man. A record is still standing. I think the season he pitched over 300 innings, and I doubted if he walked 25 men the whole year. Same thing in 1914. I don't think he ever walked a man in his life because of wildness. The only time he ever might have walked a man was because he was pitching too fine to him, not letting him to get a good ball to hit. But there was never a time he couldn't throw the ball over the plate if he wanted to. How he loved to play for him. We'd break our necks for that guy if you made an error behind him or anything of that sort. He'd never get mad or sulk. He'd come over and pat you on the back. He'd have the sweetest, most gentle nature, gentle in every way. He was a great checker player, too. He'd play several men at once. Actually, that's what made him a great pitcher, his wonderful retentive memory. Anytime you had a ball hard off of him, you never got another pitch in that spot again. You know, those fellows back there, they thought they used their head in baseball a whole lot. They talked baseball morning, noon, and night. Baseball was their whole life. We had old pitchers like Joe McNitty who'd go out and pitch 2 times in an afternoon and pitch a doubleheader. He did that a number of times. Nowadays, the pitcher wastes so much time out there, it's ridiculous. Fixing his cap, pulling up his pants, rubbing his chin, wiping his brow, pulling his nose, scratching the ground with his feet. And after he does all that, he looks all around in the outfield, and then he stares in at the catcher, giving him the sign. Why, he's afraid to throw the darn ball. With this modern jackrabbit ball, I don't know as I blame him. They waste an hour or so every day that way. We always play the game less than 2 hours, never longer. 2 hours used to be considered a long game, a really long game. We played a lot of games in an hour and a half. I played in a game that only took 58 minutes. Nowadays, a 3-hour game isn't at all unusual. At the Polo Grounds, the old New York Giants didn't even start home games until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That was because of Wall Street. The stock market didn't close until 3 o'clock. And then 2,000 or 3,000 people who worked down at Wall Street would take the elevated train up to the Polo Grounds. There were all good fans, and that was the way that they could get to the game if it was on a weekday. Of course, we played day games if we didn't start until 4 o'clock, and we didn't have any lights in those days. We just had to play a game in less time than they do today. In those days, the pitcher simply pitched, and that was that. I'm not saying that anything disparaging about the athletes of today. They're just as good and just as fast as now as they were. In fact, I think they're faster, but they've got so much to work with that we don't have. The equipment in the fields, for instance, it's just like the pole vaulters today. Like Sonny Jim, high over the fence he goes, he just boots over. In those days, we didn't have anything. Our gloves were like a motorman's mitt. Now they're similar to a lacrosse net. You just catch the ball in the net. And they strike out so much today. A lot of players with 100 strikeouts, 150 strikeouts, it's hard to believe. As old Al Smith used to say there in New York, let's take a look at the record. If you do, you'll find out that I only strike out 2 or 3 times a season. We didn't strike out, that's all. We hit the ball. We had a big, hefty bat. Mine weighed about 47 or 48 ounces. A modern ball player wouldn't have had anything to do with a bat like that. They don't have bats Now, they have whips. Thin-handled things weighing about 32 ounces because they're not trying to hit for singles and doubles. They're not trying to just meet the ball. They're all trying for the home run. Even the little shortstops and second baseman. Like the Tim McCarver, Joe Buck impression there. Another big difference between today and yesterday is that the ball players are all businessmen now. They've got agents and outside interest and all that sort of thing. We played for money too. Naturally, that's how we made our living. But we mostly played just for the love of it. Heck, most of us would have paid them to just let us play. We love baseball. I don't blame the modern players for making it while the making's good. I'm not belittling them. Why shouldn't they get the money? We never got it. I guess in a way they were dumb eggs. We played for practically nothing. My top was about $6,000. Matty never made more than about $8,000. Well, that's the way it was then. But we sure did have some ball players in those days. Old Grover Cleveland Alexander. Boy, he had stuff. Don't think he didn't. And Walter Johnson was what a pitcher he was. That Walter could buzz it by you. He sure could. He was wonderful. Fastest I ever saw. Rube Marquardt, the record books say he won 19 straight 8 games in 1912, but they're wrong. He actually won 20 straight, but they didn't give him the credit for one of them. I caught just about every one of those 20 games, and do you know that of those 20 straight wins, 16 or 17 were complete games? The only game they didn't give him credit for was one where he came in as a relief pitcher. And we scored the winning run after that. Under modern rules, Rube would get credit for the victory, but they gave it to the starting pitcher, Jeff Teshereau. At Rube's record was 19 wins and no losses in mid-July of that year. And catchers, Johnny Kling, Jimmy Archer, George Gibson, Roger Bresnahan. The best throwing catcher of them all was Jimmy Archer of the Cubs. He didn't have any arm. He had a rifle and perfect accuracy. You know, one player who never got the credit he deserved was Nap Rucker, the great Dodger left-hander. He was terrific. One of the smartest players I ever saw. And with plenty of stuff, too. I caught him when he was about through. And when I went to the Dodgers, that was in 1916. Heck, I was practically through by then myself. I was 36 years old. I didn't get into the big leagues until I was 28. And I didn't get to play regularly for the Giants until 1910. When I was 30, I cheated a little on my age, you know. So they always thought I was a few years younger, but when the years started to creep up on me, I knew how old I was, even if nobody else did. That Brooklyn ball club in 1916 was full of ex-Giants. Myself and Marquardt, Fred Merkle as well. And, of course, old Robbie was the manager. He didn't have to do much managing, though, because it was a team of veterans. Nap Rucker, Jake Daubert, Colby Jack Combs, Rube Zach Wheat, Meyers. We'd all been around a long time. And, of course, Casey Stengel. He was one of the few younger ones on that team. We won the pennant that year by just outsmarting the whole National League. That's all. It was an old, crippled club, and you might say figuratively, they had to wrap us up in bandages and carry us out to play the World Series. And we were all through. I always maintained that Casey won one more pennant than the record books show. That was 1916 with Brooklyn. Of course, Robbie was the manager, but Robbie was just a good old soul and everything. It was Casey who stepped us on our toes. He was the life of the party and kept us old-timers pepped up all season. And we knew so much baseball that we just outsmarted the rest of the league. And walked off or you might say limped off with the pennant. But of course, the years that stand out most in memory are when I was with the Giants from 1908 through 1915. So many unforgettable things happened in those years. Like the time Fred Merkle failed to touch second base, we lost the pennant in 1908. It was technicality. The New York club won that pennant, and it was taken away from us technically. As the years went by, the smartest man on the club was the bonehead Mr. Merkle. Well, McGraw was never consulted anybody except Merkle on a question of strategy or something of that sort. He never asked Matty. He never asked me. He'd say, "Fred, what do you think of this?" The bonehead would a misnomer. Or one of the smartest men in baseball, Fred Merkle. Isn't that something? It's the truth. It shows what the newspapers can do to you. After 1911 World Series is over, the Giants against Connie Mack's Philadelphia A's. Chief Bender was there with the A's. I knew Charlie quite well. He was a Chippewa from Minnesota and one of the nicest people you'd ever meet. He graduated from Carlisle and went to Dickinson College for a while. And from there, he went straight to the Athletics in 1902 or so. Didn't get to the minors at all, straight to the big leagues. He was a coach with the A's as a scout or something when he passed away in 1954 at the age of about 70. That was the series that didn't end until about the start of November. We had 6 straight days of rain in Philadelphia. Between the third and fourth games, we were behind 2-1 at the time. And don't think that wasn't hard on the nerves. Superstitious. McGraw, he had a black uniform because that's the way the Giants had been dressed when they beat the A's in the 1905 World Series. But it didn't work this time. Matty beat Bender in the first game 2-1, even though Charlie gave us only 5 hits and struck out 11. I scored the winning run myself in the 7th inning after I got a double off of Charlie. In the second game, though, Eddie Plank beat Rube Marquardt when Frank Baker hit a home run to win the game. That's the series they gave Baker his name, Home Run Baker. He hit one off Rube in the second game and another off Matty the next day. And all the while, there was a big rumpus because the newspapers were claiming that Snodgrass was trying to spike Baker to get him out of there, which wasn't so. Anyway, they beat us 4-2. They were a great team. There's no doubt about that, especially that $100,000 infield of Stuffy McInnes at first, Eddie Collins at second, Jack Berry at short, and Frank Baker at third. But I still think we were the better club. They had our signs or could read our pitchers or something. They knew what Barcroft was pitching Matty to. They're getting our sign from someplace, I told McGraw. That's our coach on third base, Harry Davis, is calling our pitches when he yells, "It's all right, it's a fastball." He must be getting them off you, McGraw said. But they weren't getting them from me. I went to Rube and to Matty and said, "Pitch whatever you want in a pitch. I'll catch you without signals." And all the guys was hollering, "It's all right," for the fastball. He knew something. I never did find out how he did it. Next year, we lost the World Series again. This time to the Boston Red Sox. That's the series they blame Fred Snodgrass because he dropped the fly ball. Newspapers blame him, that is, but we didn't. That was just a simple error. Could it happen to anybody? Neither Mr. McGraw nor anybody on the club ever censored Fred Snodgrass. He was another gentleman, a very fine fellow, proven so throughout his life. We always held him in high esteem and still do today. Heck, right after that muff, he had the greatest catch you ever saw on a line drive hit by Harry Hooper. After that, Tris Speaker hit a foul pop-up that should have been in the second out. It fell practically in the first base coach's box. For Fred Merkel or Matty could have taken it easily, but nobody did. In the second single, the speaker singled and drove it in his tying run. I gave that pop-up the old college try, but it was too far away from me to get. Matty came over too, but waited for Merkel to take it, and it fell right between all of us. I think the Red Sox dugout coached Merkel off it. The Boston bench called for Matty to take it and called for me to take it, and I think that confused Fred. He was afraid of a collision, you see. The Red Sox bench was right there near where the ball fell, and they just coached him off of it. Well, that's all right. It's all part of the game. The year after that was the year Jim Thorpe joined us. Jim was a sack and fox from Oklahoma originally. I roomed with him. Gee, he was an Adonis. I don't know how to say that. But built like a Greek god. The greatest all-around athlete who ever lived. Agreed by all the experts as one of the greatest and most wonderful athletes the world has ever known. They may top his records. You always get topped, you know. But in his day, he had no equal. All-American football player at Carlisle and winner of everything in sight at the 1912 Olympics in Stockholm. He wasn't as good in baseball as he was in football and track, where he was in a class all by himself. However, he was good enough to stay in the big leagues in almost 10 years. Boy, could that guy ever eat. For breakfast, he'd order a beefsteak smothered in pork chops and corned beef and cabbage. That was his favorite. He could down 4 servings in one sitting. Jim was very proud of the great things he'd done. Very proud man, not conceited. He never was that, but proud. King's Gustav of Sweden pinned that last Olympic gold medal on Jim. He looked at that American Indian and shook his hand and said, "Sir, you are the greatest athlete in the world." Jim never forgot that, and he never got over what happened after the Olympics were finished. When they took all his medals and trophies away from him, they claimed he had violated his amateur status by playing semi-pro ball during summers when he was going to Carlisle. They made him return every one of his Olympic medals and trophies, and that broke his heart. It really did. I remember very late one night, Jim came in and woke me up. I remember it like that was only last night. He was crying and tears were cheeks rolling down his cheeks. "You know, Chief," he said, "the King of Sweden gave me those trophies. He gave them to me, but they took them away from me. Even though the guy who finished second refused to take them. They're mine, Chief. I won them fair and square." It broke his heart, and he never really recovered. Those days, you know, the Indian was in the position of a minority group. Still is, for that matter. Nowadays, they can't ridicule an Irishman on television. You can't ridicule a Jew. You can't ridicule a Negro. But they can kill us all the time. Make everything out of us they want. Every night you see them on television killing us Indians. That's all they do. The only reason I don't look at anything but a ball game or the news on television. I like the ball games and the news, but after the news, in comes the killing. Those things, I don't like to talk about them. I see them, I know them, but I don't like to talk about them. The world seems to be turned all upside down today. Progress, they call it, and the radio and the television all brainwashing the children and teaching them to cheat and steal and kill. Always violence and killing. I think it's awful, a bad example for the youngsters. Why can't they teach people about the good things of life instead? In the old days, you know, a shake of your hand was your word and your honor. Those days, if anything was honest and upright, we'd say it was on the square. Nowadays, they even turned that word around. Now it means you don't belong. You're nothing. Square deal. It's no more. You're a square. Where do they get that stuff anyhow? It doesn't make sense. At least not to me, it doesn't. I guess I'm like the venerable old warrior chief of the great Six Nations, who announced his retirement by saying, I'm like an old hemlock. My head is still high, but the winds of close to 100 winters have whistled through my branches, and I've been witness to many wondrous and many tragic things. My eyes pervasive in the present, but my roots are embedded deeply in the grandeur of the past.